We live. Good evening. This is BizPreneur, premiering our second edition of Women as Legacy Builders. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Palesa Munzara, Ph.D. candidate from Wits. I will let Palesa introduce herself because I've known Palesa for over 20 years from when we were at UCT, and she's done such amazing things since that time. So welcome, Palesa, and please tell us more about what you do.
Hi, Ilona. Thanks for having me. I am so excited to be doing this talk with you. I mean, like you say, we've known each other for almost 2 decades about, kind of gives away our age. But anyway, it's really awesome to be reconnecting in this way. I'm Palesa. I am a marketing and diversity consultant. My professional background is in brand marketing. I've worked primarily across FMCGs, fast-moving consumer goods companies, various corporates in South Africa. I've spent some time in the finance industry. I've spent some time working in QSR, quick service restaurants, which is really fast food industry. My career has allowed me to work across very diverse teams, across diverse cultures. I've spent some time working in teams across Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and most recently across our continent, West Africa, East Africa, and the SADC region. I have loved it. I miss traveling. COVID has changed so much for us. I miss meeting with the people physically. We've all had to learn to live in this virtual world. But this love of working with and learning about diversity in the workplace is what led me to pursuing my PhD that you mentioned earlier. My PhD, which I recently submitted, was in critical diversity studies. My research was focused specifically on race and gender, specifically looking at Black African women in the finance industry. Which is really where my passion lies, in the field of gender equality in social justice. I love working with organizations in order to make their cultures more inclusive. We live in such a diverse country, you know, Ilona, and I would love to see corporates in this country reflecting that diversity.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Palesa. I look forward to reading that thesis. It sounds just like what the country needs. So I had our poster up the whole day and a couple of days, and I had so many questions asking, what is allyship? What are you guys going to talk about? So maybe as a start, just what is allyship?
It's about being an ally, really, simply put. Allyship is about standing in solidarity with somebody who doesn't have the same level of opportunities or access to the same level of opportunities as you might. It's to really when a person who is in a position of power or in a position of privilege uses that power or that privilege to advocate for change. I think one of the best examples we have of allyship is the women of 1956 in this country who marched to the union buildings, protesting the pass laws. You know, there were white women there, there were Indian women there were colored women there, all standing in solidarity with Black African women and Black African people. I think a key thing to highlight about allyship is when you are fighting for a cause that doesn't directly impact you. And I really love using that example of those women. I mean, it's something that happened about, 65 years ago? But I think it's still such a relevant example that we can still look back on and reflect on in understanding how there's such power in the collective and in understanding that there is an opportunity for us, all of us, to help effect change, even if it does not directly impact us.
Awesome. So really, I'm just thinking there's a lot of women programs. Why is allyship important?
I think in the world we live in, there's no more neutrality. You either have to be part of the solution or you're going to be part of the problem. Allyship is important because each one of us has an opportunity to uplift one another. So in the spirit of it being August and it being Women's Month, I am speaking specifically to women as a collective. So allyship, I mean, you can look at it from across the board. You can look at it from a race point of view where white people can be allies to Black people. You can look at it from a able-bodied disability point of view where able-bodied people can be allies to disabled people. But I think in the spirit of Women's Month, I'm quite keen to just talk around how with allyship, women can help themselves as a group collectively. I think allyship is important because some of our greatest struggles as women lie in dismantling the structural foundations of gender inequality. These inequalities exist in so many different ways. If we think about the workplace, in the gender pay gap, in limited growth and development opportunities, and a host of others. Allyship is a tool in ensuring that women's voices are heard in spaces and places where these structural changes can actually be made. With key decision makers in boardrooms when growth and development opportunities are being discussed, where policy reforms are made, where organizational cultures are being created. When you are an ally, when you're a person in a position of power, when you're a woman in a position of power, in a senior role, you have the ability, of the opportunity to call out these inequalities. You have an opportunity to effect change. I think by supporting each other, by sharing experiences, by sharing tips, women can accelerate their progress in the workplace and just general holistic well-being. There's so much opportunity that exists for us to help ourselves as women. And I think that's really the importance of allyship.
Awesome. I love that. And you've really given a systemic description. It's across society and also in the workplace. So as a woman, how do I know if I qualify to be an ally? So who exactly are we talking about? Who can and should be an ally?
I'm talking to everyone. All of us should be allies. Each one of us find ourselves in a position where we can actually effect change. I mean, if I think back at the example I gave earlier, the women who gathered on the 9th of August in 1956 were women from all different walks of life. There were domestic workers there were activists there, and each one of them had the same equal opportunity in that moment to effect change. So I really am speaking to each one of us. I am speaking to white women to be allies to women of color. I am speaking to senior women to be allies to junior women. It really is something that I feel as women, each one of us has an opportunity and a duty to take advantage of.
Great. So there isn't really a woman who can say, I don't have opportunity to be an ally for somebody.
No.
So, when we speak about women being allies to each other, is that actually feasible, since we are all disadvantaged or marginalized? Do we have collective power? Aren't we expecting the people in the struggle to kind of lift themselves up? What are your thoughts there?
I think that's a great question. I think for me, understanding our own identity as individuals is a key step in becoming an ally. It's important for each one of us to recognize and acknowledge our own positions of privilege first. And then that should then enable us to empathize with other people's experiences. So, for example, you might find yourself sitting in a room and I've seen this in my career, and it's been a big bugbear of mine. You sit in a room and somebody is speaking. So you are two women in a room, and there are a bunch of other people, men and women. You are somebody speaking, but the way in which they are speaking is not in an accent that is commonly heard in the boardroom. So maybe you have a very heavy Zulu accent or a very heavy Sotho accent or whatever. And you don't have that accent that sounds like you went to a private school. I've seen it too many times where a person who might actually have a really good point very quickly gets dismissed because I don't understand what you're saying, Lerato. So we move on quickly. As a woman, also facing issues of sexism and gender discrimination in the workplace, I also have my struggles. In that moment, the discussion is not about me. That position of privilege suddenly rests with me, So in that moment, I have an opportunity to then call it out and say, sorry, John, actually, Lerato was onto something. I would love for Lerato to finish what she's saying. So it's just like, it's small actions that have a big impact. So being an ally it's not some massive thing that you need to do, some massive organizational change that you need to effect. It's like a small thing like that, where you find yourself in, I'm calling it a position of privilege because it is. In that moment, we will listen to Ilona because she sounds right. She sounds educated, and we might not listen to Lerato in that moment. So it is your duty as Ilona or as Palesa in that moment to ensure that Lerato is actually heard.
I love that. And that calls for self-awareness. And like you said, being aware of your position of privilege, which is forever shifting. Like you said, in that moment, you may not be the most disadvantaged. That's really, really amazing. So what would be expected of an ally? If we've spoken of the example in the boardroom, there's some really obvious examples, senior managers and junior women in the workplace. What would be expected, from an ally, in the role of an ally?
I think the first thing as an ally is first do no harm. It's important for an ally, for you as an ally, for me as an ally, to understand that we're not being a savior here. Our role is not to feel sorry or to pity someone. Our role is not to walk ahead or lead someone. It's really to walk beside or even behind the woman that you're supporting. You're speaking on behalf of, you're using your position to uplift that person to stand on their own. The role of an ally it involves behavior change, which can be, I think it can be uncomfortable, it can be complex, can be complicated. But I think, what is key to understand as an ally is just using your privilege in a moment to extend to someone else. And ally is about action. So it's no good just saying, I believe in allyship, I am an ally, and going to someone and saying, I stand with you. That's great, but what are you actually doing? Are you using your voice, to make that change? Are you speaking up in that room? It can be quite exhausting. Can you imagine you're sitting in a room and you must always be the person that's like, sorry, I just want to make sure Lerato is heard. But that's what it calls for, You need to put yourself out there. You need to use some of your social capital to actually ensure that change starts to happen.
Awesome. I was just thinking, won't I look like an activist if we is there a difference between allyship and activism?
I mean, you become a corporate activist when you think about it in the workplace. That is what you're doing. You are speaking on behalf of, you are acting in solidarity with. So it is, in my view, I don't see a big difference between being an activist and being an ally. Those women of 1956 that I keep referring to, those were, there were people who were politicians, who were activists, but they were also domestic workers and just regular folk who were doing activist work, in that particular moment on that particular day. So absolutely, I think it's one of the same thing, really, in terms of what it boils down to.
Great. So a lot of women tend to see the injustice, see it in the recruitment processes, see it in many spaces in the workplace, but it's almost as if we need some permission or some guidelines of what's the right way to go about this without sabotaging myself and maybe the other person. How do you actually start, the journey of being an ally?
You're absolutely right. And I think the thing with being an ally is there are risks. You have to put yourself out there. You have to use, like I say, some of that social capital that you might have spent years and years and years building for yourself to use on someone else in order to be collective over time. I think there are a few practical steps in starting your journey towards becoming an ally. The list is not exhaustive, but I will share like 3 steps. I think the first one is to seek opportunities to hear different women's stories. Just because I am a woman and you are a woman, it doesn't mean that we share the same struggle or that we share the same lived experience. I can't assume that I know exactly what you're going through, Ilona, day to day. And you can't assume that you know what I go through day to day. So it's important to spend some time hearing you, understanding you. I think too often when we do listen to each other, we only listen long enough to find an opening to jump into the conversation instead of, taking time to truly understand you and understand the ideas that you're conveying. I think it's important in becoming an ally to practice active listening in that way. I also think we need to spend some time adding diversity in the stories that we immerse ourselves in. My favorite author that I'm sure you know of, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I totally love her. I think I've read everything she's written. I think she's amazing. I think she's just brilliant. But she does a lot of TED Talks. And one of her TED Talks, she talks about the danger of a single story.
Yes.
And basically, she talks about how a single story creates stereotypes. She says the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So I might listen to the story of somebody who comes from Uganda, and it's a Black woman from Uganda. She shares her story, she shares her experience with me, and I walk away and I use that one woman's story as representation of all the Ugandan women's stories. You know,
Yeah.
it's the most ridiculous thing, but it happens so often. You know, you walk away and you say, Ugandan women are XYZ, or Ugandan women think 1, 2, 3. That might not necessarily be true. That's just true of that one particular person's story. And I guess that's what Chimamanda was talking about in, you know, there's danger in doing that, in using that one single story as the story. So I think that's an important thing to do. I think biases are actually perpetuated when incomplete stories are told. You walk away with this one piece of information, you roll it out, and you conduct yourself accordingly because you believe that that is true of the whole. So I think in being an ally, it's important for us to understand each other and understand each other to that level of detail. Yeah, I think that's important in becoming an effective ally. The second thing is, while allies need to listen, an effective ally also needs to speak. So, you know, if you want to be an ally, please do use your voice, become a sponsor for women, you know, endorse them publicly, speak their name when they're not in the room. I think it's important as women for us to normalize talking about the brilliance of other women, talk about the brilliance of your colleagues, your juniors, your seniors, your peers, for it to be normal in the workplace that we talk about a project that was well executed, followed by the name of a woman. And that, you know, that should be done in mass by us as women. Of course, we need allyship from men too, but, you know, we need to do it for ourselves as well. The other thing that is a massive like frustration for me that I've seen in my career is that women's ideas are often not credited to them.
Yes.
It's amazing. You could be sitting in the same room with someone who literally steals your idea in the same room, in the same conversation. So you say something, somebody else says it just using slightly different words. And then suddenly that idea is credited to that person. And it's like, you know, you look around the room and you're like, did no one hear that I just said that?
Oh, yeah.
When I speak to women, it's a common theme. I hear this all the time. I've experienced it myself. I think most of us as women, we've heard it, we've seen it, we've witnessed it, we've experienced it. So I think an ally is someone who will, in a moment like that, when someone takes an idea that Ilona's just shared, repackages it, someone will be like, that's great. Just as Ilona had mentioned, I love that you just said that, John, you know, but bringing it back to you so that when we walk out of the room, exactly to the original owner of the idea, that when we walk out of the room, we remember that actually it was Ilona's idea. That stuff actually matters. And if you're early, you know what I mean? And if you're early in your career, I think it's important that you don't underestimate the value of your input. Sometimes when we are starting out in our careers, when we're junior in our careers, we think that our ideas don't have value. But you may have just gone through something that someone who is right now starting out is going through. So absolutely use your voice, share those ideas. And of course, if you're in a much more senior position, go beyond just offering advice. Mentoring is important. There's value in mentoring, but be actively involved in aiding another woman's career progress. You know, put their name forward when an opportunity comes about and actually push for that. Become an actual sponsor.
I love what you've just said. You know, when you speak about that, we need to get off the couch and start to put actions and words to our allyship. I mean, I've heard the issues of ideas being taken by men in the boardrooms and in teams and so on. And you've just made it come alive to say, what do you do in that moment? Because I think sometimes there's a lot of thought in retrospect to say, that didn't go well. But I think you're giving such great points that a lot of women can start to implement. I just want to read some comments from the people that have joined us. Nosipo says, I love this topic. And Amina said, I love this, knowing what to do with your power to create positive change. Because your narrative really is lovely. Women are not powerless, regardless of what position in society you hold. Every single woman can be an ally. Thank you so much for that, because we often assume that you only can do stuff once you become the executive head of this and that. But what happens before that? Everybody seems to think, I don't have power because I'm not an HOD. I don't have power because I'm just an intern. But, yeah.
Yeah, and I completely get it. I mean, when you put yourself out there, even if you are a senior or an exec lady, I interviewed very senior to executive level women for my PhD research, and it was very fascinating for me to hear their stories and understand how their career progression has been impacted by issues of race and gender in the workplace, and how it continues to be impacted and how it continues to be negatively affected. And just hearing their stories and understanding that the struggle continues. It's not like you get to some point as a woman and you're sitting in the C-suite and suddenly you are completely respected. Many of them still talk about walking into a client meeting and sitting across the table with the client, and the client busy going like this, like, is there someone else coming in before we start the meeting? And you're like, no, actually, I am the person here.
I'm chairing.
I am chairing. You're here to meet me. So the struggle continues. The struggle continues.
There's a comment here of maybe if you can unpack what you mean by social capital in this context. Yeah.
So I guess, when you've spent time working and building relationships and networking in an organization and getting yourself to be viewed, perceived and respected at a certain level. And it's not necessarily to do with levels of seniority. It's just over time you've delivered on work, but you've made sure that you've built relationships and people like you and people trust you with work and people trust your opinion. So it goes beyond just the material fact of I am an educated person. I come into this role with XYZ qualifications, or that I am a person at this level of seniority or whatever. It really is the time you've taken, the effort you've taken to build yourself to being a respected individual in a space and place. That's really what I mean by a social capital. So now once you've gotten yourself to a certain level from social capital point of view, then you start to use some of that, because I am a respected person in this room, I am going to use my voice and I know they'll hear me because I have done this for myself. Now, when you start to use that to, I guess, start to dismantling some of these structures that benefit some of the people in the room, that's what I mean by saying there are certain risks associated with being an ally from that perspective. But I think if more and more of us do it, if more and more of us, if it becomes something that's done in mass, the change will and must happen, over time.
Thank you. I see Prof. Jire is logged on. This is a gentleman that is constantly advocating for young women in his industry. So I just wanted to know, how can we involve men in this allyship? Because there's always a narrative that men, don't promote women, but for those men out there that are interested in allyship, what is an inclusive way of doing this together?
So I'm really happy that we have men on this talk. It is very important that we have men coming along with us on this journey. I think, the 2 steps that I've shared are very much applicable to men too. The listening and immersing yourself in stories, particularly important for men to understand women's perspectives, to understand where we're coming from when we speak about, our position in the workplace. Sometimes I've had conversations with men where they're like, this is an awesome working place, isn't it? Like, there isn't much discrimination, sexism that happens here. And I laugh because I'm like, I don't think you're in a position to make that statement. What would be great is if you took time to speak to a couple of women and understand their perspective. So I think the advocacy part, the sponsorship, the championing of women's careers is an important thing and very relevant to men. I think an additional tool that is relevant for men and women, really, to add on to the 2 that I've already mentioned. The third one is speaking up against, injustices when you witness a moment of sexism happening, particularly for men. If you're sitting in a room and a sexist joke is being made, please call it out. Call it out in the moment.
Call it out. Yes.
Call it out. Do not remain silent. Your silence is tacit approval of what's being said. So I think it's important. If you're a man, please recruit other men to come join
them. Yes.
Other men. We need more men. We need more men to be buying into allyship, to be supporting the progression of women. But I think there's so much opportunity for men, for men to come on board and actually speak up. I think it's just, there are too many times where you might have a conversation with a guy after a meeting where a sexist joke was made, and that guy will say to you, the woman, that wasn't cool. I'm really sorry that was said in that room, which is great, but you should have said it in the room to that person.
Even better. Yes, exactly.
Even better,
Okay, there's a question from Dr. Nosipo. What are the pitfalls of allyship? Is there a possibility of overestimating your role? How do you, okay, I'll ask this one, there's another one. So let's ask, is there a possibility of overestimating your role?
I mean, I think if you think of allyship as being a supporter, I don't think you are putting yourself in a position where you could be overestimating your role, because you are merely being a supporter. I think where there is risk is when you start carrying that badge of being an ally, like some badge of honor, like you are the savior of women, or you are the savior of whichever marginalized group you are standing in support of. I refer us back to those points around, what is the role of an ally? The role of an ally is very much to just stand beside, and use your moments where you have that power, or where you find yourself in a position of privilege, to ensure that you're creating space But I think it's very important as allies, even as women allies to each other, to humble ourselves in how we approach being champions for each other.
Okay, thank you. Amina says, it's a comment, I think when we aren't conscious of our own privilege or how much social capital we have in different spaces, it becomes easy to not stand up for ourselves and the people that we stand with. Because so that point that you spoke about, be aware of how much social capital you have, how much privilege you possess in a specific context. So, and a question from a guy, Robin. Hi, Lona and Palesa. What are some of the ways in which men cause harm or damage while they think they are helping?
Robert, I'm so happy you asked that question. I think one of the blind spots maybe is when a very well-intentioned man makes assumptions about the experiences or the lived realities of women, basing them on either just their observations of what they think they see, or basing them on just one particular woman they know. Again, going back to that danger of a single story. I think one of the most effective ways to overcome this is through dialogue. I'm an absolute believer in dialogue. I think in having conversations with women, particularly as a man, it helps to shed light, to ensure that you're not making those assumptions, and really understanding and getting to the core of what are the issues. And I think, depending on how you approach these questions that you ask women, you will get candid and frank answers, which I think will help you towards becoming an effective ally.
Thank you so much. And one of the key points that Palesa's brought across is avoid assumptions. Assumptions really muddle things up. So through dialogue and getting clarity, you're halfway there. We have another question. How do you advocate without taking up space in the process of advocating?
It's a very interesting question. I think, using your voice in certain places when you are sitting in a boardroom and a career opportunity is being discussed. I think there's a nice opportunity there to advocate, and really you're not taking up anyone's space in that moment. You're actually uplifting and propelling somebody else who is in a position of marginalization in that moment to say, I think Ilona would be fantastic for this position because she has done XYZ, which I think is perfectly well suited for this role, and you pushing for that opportunity in that way. I think, I think it's important for us to understand that some of these moments of advocating can, like I mentioned earlier, be very small moments of advocating. And some of them don't even have to be public moments of advocating. It could very well be as a man in a circle of your guy friends that you start to change the tone of the conversation. You start to change the way women are being referred to in those conversations, and you start to bring some positive stories about, what you've seen women in your team, women in your circle, women in your family doing, and in that way starting to reshape the conversation. Or it could be that as a group of white women, you are sitting in your social circles or in your your peer groups, and you start to change the narrative around women of color. So not all moments of allyship or not all moments of advocating for marginalized groups need to be public or need to be big in order to be effective.
Great. I think also what's coming through is you're saying when you know better, you start to do better, think better, and speak better. That's really, really important. So when we're changing our own mindsets, we will start to influence those around us. So we've heard from men. I'm very glad that there's men who are commenting and joining us because it's not an us and them, but there is work to be done for women, as we are in Women's Month. What are some of the tips you can give if I'm not necessarily I want to say an advocate, if I don't feel that I'm very good at standing up for people publicly? You've spoken about that. Not everything has to be private, has to be public. What are the things that I can do, small doses of change towards standing up for others, if I don't feel that I'm a public advocate? Or
I think one of the first things to do is to educate yourself. I think it's important for each one of us, if we're wanting to become an effective ally, to educate ourselves, just to understand privilege and to understand what privilege means, and to understand where we sit, in terms of the spectrum of privilege. I think, conversation and dialogue is one thing that I've been talking about. There is a ton of research that is online. There are a ton of books, podcasts, TED Talks that exist. The reason I say it's important for us to educate ourselves first is until you understand where you sit in the spectrum of power or privilege, I don't think you can fully appreciate your position of power and privilege. And I think when power starts to shift, there's this saying I heard some time ago that says, when you are used to being in a position of power and privilege, equality might start feeling like oppression. So I think it's important for each one of us to start educating ourselves in order for us to be able to recognize our privilege. I think once we do that, then it becomes easier for us to start identifying those who are not in our positions. And I think the list is so long, in terms of how you might be privileged and how another person might not be privileged or disempowered in certain moments or in certain spaces. So I think that for me is a fundamental starting point.
Thank you very much, because oftentimes we stay out of the drama, I want to call it that, because we say, oh, but I don't even have power to change anybody's mind.
Yeah.
I'm just, sticking myself out there. There's work to be done on the personal front as well. Educate yourself, and read. Like you mentioned, one very important thing that we brush over, the unconscious bias. It's important, in this journey of trying to understand our position in society, in the workplace as allies. What are the biases that I carry, even about other women? So I'm really glad that you've brought that in, because it highlights that there's work to be done, even as women, in how do we empower other women? Are we bystanders as we watch this?
Absolutely. And I think, an important thing for us to remind ourselves of is social justice and gender equality call for each one of us to participate, for us to be allies on, to one another. I think, as you very rightly say, a lot of the time we just kind of sit back If it's not impacting me directly and I don't really want to be involved in the politics of it all, I'm just going to be quiet. And then the problem perpetuates, and at some point, it just gets worse and it gets bigger, and we wonder why it persists. It's because nobody's doing anything about it. You don't want to do anything about it.
Yes, and the women concerned are standing alone.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much. I'm going to just check again for comments and questions from our audience. But while I'm doing that, maybe you can give us some of your closing thoughts on the topic. We really want to maximize our time with you because you have such great insights. So yeah, if you can give us the closing thoughts, and then I'll read out some comments as well.
Sure. I think, one of my favorite quotes goes something like this. If we don't deliberately, intentionally, and proactively include, we will unintentionally exclude. So that whole bystander mentality where you're witnessing things happening around you, and you just kind of stand by, you've already made a standing by.
Yeah.
You've made a choice to continue in a very exclusionary culture where you are not doing anything to ensure that the culture becomes more inclusive. So really, each one of us has a duty to ensure that change is effected. And being neutral in those situations is actually not being neutral at all.
There is no neutrality. There's no neutrality. Yeah. Somebody is asking if you can give a reading list, a book list for somebody who's just joined today and finds this really interesting, but then also recognizes that they just have not read enough on this topic. What are some starting points or book lists?
So one of my, I am an absolute avid believer and reader across the board of, I have a lot of diversity in reading. And I think when we think about allyship, it's important. Today we're talking about it from a woman perspective, because it's Women's Month and it's our time. But I think it's important to think about allyship from as a broader concept. Just, as a people, how do we relate with one another? A lot of my reading is very academic and can be boring sometimes.
Yeah.
But one of my favorite books that I read recently, and very much around race and race topics, is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which, yes, talks about white fragility. But when I read that book, it also helped me reflect on a number of issues as a woman. And I think there's if you're a white woman reading the book in particular, there's a chapter called White Women's Tears, and how white women's tears, are actually weapons and can be weaponized against Black women, against Black people. So that's one great book to read. The other book I've really enjoyed reading is How to Be a Black Person. And I just don't know how to pronounce this gentleman's name, but the surname is Tunde. I'm just actually gonna have to look it up, and I'll share it. I don't know if there's a platform, Ilona, where we can digitally share some of these. So I'll share some of those, definitely.
Okay, great. Somebody, T says, great discussion, very informative, and empowered to do something in my corner. Thank you. I really want you to get these comments before we go offline. So Palesa, I know this is some work. There's some work that you do for corporate to help them on some of these issues? Maybe you can just share with that shortly, in a short way. What is some of the work that you've been doing, or the work that you can do for organizations and teams that feel that, now I'm inspired to do something about gender disparities and so on?
So I do a number of things, workshops, deliver talks. A lot of the work I do is around just creating awareness, doing a lot of educational type of talks, and using practical tools. I just feel like sometimes we listen to things and you walk away and you're like, well, that was great to hear, but now what must I do? What must I do about it? So some of the work I do is around, how you actually practically affect change by way of how you rework your policies, your gender policies, etc. In the workplace. I do, this month, I've been doing quite a few talks, Women's Day talks, which I've really enjoyed, by the way. Like I said earlier, I am a firm believer in dialogue. And some of the blind spots that exist, I've learned, and I now have come to understand that some of the blind spots that exist and some of the disparities that exist are just from lack of understanding or lack of knowledge. People haven't thought of some of these things. You don't experience them yourself, so you don't think of them. Or even if you do experience them yourself, you don't have a way of actually articulating it. So it's just like, there's this thing I'm experiencing, but I don't know how to say it because I don't have a word for it. So some of our workshops cover those sorts of things. So yeah, I really enjoy working with corporates, having spent a lot of time in corporate myself. Yeah, so that's basically it.
Okay, so we will share your contact details with anybody that wants to get hold of you for this amazing work. I mean, there's a saying that says, once a wheel starts turning, we're not stopping it. So I hope that this allyship is not just for Women's Month, but it is something that we continuously do, because then 1956 would have been, pointless if we only remember this in August and do it in August and forget about it in September. Then the battle hasn't even started.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in referencing those 1956 women, and for someone who might be like, I'm not really impacted by any of these, I haven't really experienced anything that you're speaking of. The women of 1956, it's estimated that there were about 20,000 women that marched on that day. They were carrying petitions. And the opening statement in those petitions I absolutely love, because it's such a beautiful way of conveying what allyship is when we think about matters that aren't directly impacting us. That petition starts with, "We, the women of South Africa, have come here today. We African women know too well the effect this law has upon our homes, our children. We who are not African women know how our sisters suffer. For to us, an insult to African women is an insult to all women." So I just think it's such a lovely way to convey the message of allyship. Those white women who marched on that day could have very simply stayed home, not involved themselves. The laws of the country were very much on their side. They could have, stood by and done absolutely nothing. And who knows where we would be today as a nation. And I think we are a better nation. We absolutely are a better country as a result of actions taken by people who at the time were not directly affected or impacted by something that was happening.
Oh, that is so, so beautiful and impactful. I have one question. I really hope we can squeeze it in. Is the concept of allyship something that is discussed or integrated into workplace culture or in policies on diversity, if you've seen? If not, do you think there's a reason why?
I have not seen it. I have not seen it being intentionally included or even discussed. I think there's opportunity for more of it to happen. I think perhaps the reason it's not that common is there's a culture within a lot of organizations, NGOs, corporates across the board, of this expectation of leadership or people in senior roles being the ones responsible and able to affect any kind of change. So in order for us to see change, I need my CEO to do it. I need the exec to do it. It needs to come from the top. And until it comes from the top down, it's not going to happen. I just work here. So I need my seniors to do something about it. Where allyship, as we've discussed, calls for all of us to do something, for us to do something peer-to-peer, absolutely senior to junior, but it doesn't stop and end there. So I think organizational culture typically is this expectation of top down, and there's missed opportunity, at the same level for people, for ourselves to be doing for ourselves.
Thank you very much. You are basically reminding us that every woman has power to be an ally. You don't have to wait until you're the exec or you're the head. Don't give away your power. Now, thank you very much to our audience on YouTube, on Facebook, and on LinkedIn. There's a lot of great commentary. Somebody's asked if you're going to come back to talk about something else. I hope you do.
I hope I get
Thank
invited.
Thank you very much. This is the invite. So we're going to close it off now, and we'll see everybody next week at the same time. We'll be hosting Lucy Coffee, who is a medical anthropologist, and will continue on the series of Women as Legacy Builders. Thank you very much.